So if you want to see a room get really quiet really fast, ask this question. How do you define diversity? See? Works every time. People get really uncomfortable, not just with trying to define that, but trying to live that, trying to understand it even. Now, I happen to be married to the smartest person on the planet. And she works with a company that goes all over the States and helps people understand exactly what that word means and how do we live better around that meaning. And this is how they define diversity. I think it's the best definition ever. It's any difference that makes a difference. That's a little less clear-cut than maybe I would have defined it. That's a little bigger, right? That's a little more broad than even you would have initially thought. It's any difference that makes a difference. It's anything about us that's different from the person next to us that's going to cause friction, tension, misunderstanding. And this is a problem, because what it means is anytime there's more than one person, there's going to be differences. There's going to be diversity, right? There's going to be 2 people or 3 people or 4 people or 100 people, and none of them are going to be the same. If you look around this room, none of us are the same. God's really that creative that not one of us is identical in every way to anyone else in this room. So if we're in a culture that's full of these kinds of differences and they're making differences in our relationships, then how in the world are we supposed to navigate our office? How in the world are we supposed to navigate our neighborhood, right? The neighborhood can be one of the trickier spots because you don't get to choose who moves into your neighborhood. At work, everybody's kind of about the same thing and maybe went to some of the same schooling and you have some commonality there that you can build on. But in the neighborhood, it's like anybody can move in there. And what about the church? What about our church? You think there's differences here? Do you think they make differences? Yeah, they do. And I'll tell you the truth. I don't know that the church, big C, and by big C I just mean global church, really gets it. But I think we should. In fact, I think we should be the leaders in this area. We should be setting the pace. We should be agents of change in our culture, in our society, in our world. And we're lagging behind. So I want to talk about that some today and just kind of pull that apart and examine it and maybe wrestle a little bit with what is our part then? What are we supposed to be doing? And how that'll work in some ways is I want to give you kind of an in living color example of what this is like. Because if it's any difference that makes a difference, you could have a group of people in a room that look a lot alike, maybe even sound a lot alike, but aren't all that alike. And so I want to introduce you to a group of friends that came together as a community group a couple years back. And you're going to notice some interesting things about them. You're going to get to hear their story. And just even though that they might look a little bit alike, there's a lot of differences still present. So will you give a warm welcome to my friends Joanne, Tula, and Anna. Came right out on cue. I love segments like this because I get to be like Oprah or something cool. Unfortunately, we don't have any cars to give away. So anyway, next time. Well, let's just start simple because I think everybody's looking at this platform going, where's the diversity? Because we have 3 women that are seemingly the same, but you're not. So how about we do this? Let's just start one at a time. Can you give us your name? And I already asked them if I could ask them to give their age, so don't get mad at me. Your name, your age, and just tell us a little bit about your upbringing. And maybe specifically, was church a part of that whole thing? Can you start us off?
I will. My name is Tula Rainwater. I am 46 years old. I come from a big, fat Greek family. I am number 4 from a family of 5 children. My parents immigrated here from Greece. It was an arranged marriage. And church was a huge part of our lives. Grew up in the Greek Orthodox Church. We were there every Sunday, but it was all about church. And I really didn't have a relationship with Jesus. I didn't understand the cross. And that's about it. My parents stayed together until my father passed away in 2011.
So, big family, immigrant family, different church upbringing than one like this.
Yes.
Joanne, I bet yours is just the same.
Nope. Born and raised in, Joanne Rathundi, 56 years old. Born and raised in Lake County. My parents, my dad was raised Catholic, mom was raised Lutheran. And we were brought to Sunday school as little kids, and then we decided at a certain age we didn't want to go anymore, and so we would pretend to sleep and not have to go. But they still live in our childhood home, and I did not meet Jesus until I was in high school.
Joanne, that's nothing like Tula's story. How about you, Anna?
I'm Anna Briner. I am 51 years old. We had a rule in our house that on Sundays or anytime the church was open, we were there as a family. It wasn't until I moved out on my own that I decided that my life, I knew what was best for me. So many years later, 2 failed marriages, and my life was just mentally and physically broken. I came back to church, and Emmanuel has been part of my life since, and then I joined the Jan's small group. And that's where we all became friends.
So you approach some people about, hey, I want to get in community. They kind of say, here's community for you to have, right? You didn't get to have like a draft of who you wanted to be in that group. You all sit down for the first time together. What's going through your head as the conversation started? What kinds of things were you thinking about being in group with people that you maybe thought were going to be just like you, but aren't just like you?
We had nothing in common other than Jesus.
Nothing in common?
Well, we all decided that in the beginning that each of us privately, we didn't know this until we sat together and talked, but that we all thought that we were not going to fit in this group. I thought that privately, she thought that, Anna thought that, yeah. And Nancy, who's not here, she's our fourth one, she thought the same thing.
So you're thinking you're not going to fit, one, but you're also thinking other people in the room aren't going to fit. I remember when we talked before, Tula, you had said you had looked at Joanne and thought, this isn't going to work.
Right. I looked at Joanne and I was like, she's got it put together. There's no way she's going to fit, because I was hurting at the time pretty badly. And yeah, I didn't think she was going to fit at all until we all started opening up and becoming vulnerable. And when she did that, I was like, oh, she'll fit in just fine.
Did you gel quickly? I mean, there's maybe that initial conversation where you start to realize, oh, there are some common things, but was it all magic right away?
No, and we definitely had our differences. I mean, we had some pretty heated discussions, but even still, even though we would get upset, we had different opinions on scripture and how to do life and that sort of thing, we still loved each other. It didn't matter that we didn't agree. We could still love each other, and I thought that was really a cool thing. Yeah.
It's amazing to me, because I think most people would look at you guys and go, they'll click right away. They're all the same, but that's just not the case, right? So what held you together? I mean, you were a group for a while, you're still really good friends. What held you together?
I think over time you stop seeing differences and you start seeing hearts. And I think that was our still is our draw together, that the struggles and all of the things that we bring to the group, it's what's in the heart. It's our hearts for Jesus, and it's knowing that we're all growing in the same direction.
Yeah.
And I think that really holds us together.
Yeah, so you guys still hang out, right? Concert recently and all that kind of stuff. Even though the group's not like all official, like you're not part of the group in the same way, just
Correct.
friends. Yeah.
Correct.
I think that's amazing. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your story. Will you thank them with me?
You're welcome.
So here's what I'm trying to do in that conversation, establish a baseline, right? If there's differences in people who, at least on the surface, seem to be all the same, how much more complicated does it get when the surface doesn't even look the same? And how do we navigate relationships, especially in the church, with people that are in the same row as us, or people that are in the neighborhood next door to us, if we're guaranteed that it's not all going to be sunshine and rainbows all the time? And does Jesus really call us to worry about this? This is kind of the question, right? Is this just touchy-feely, like we want to be a 21st century society where we wrap our arms around everybody and sing Kumbaya or something like that? No, it's not that. It's deeper than that. So if at any point you're tempted to kind of write this off as like, well, I'm more concerned with the deep discipleship stuff, this is about as deep of discipleship as it gets. Because I don't know if you knew this, and it took me a while to really understand this, but there are parts of our scriptures, of the New Testament and Old Testament, that point to we are supposed to lead the way in building relationships with people that are nothing like us and embracing the differences and celebrating the differences. It was the brother of Jesus who said it most pointedly, and I've been trying to warn you all the way in this little conversation that we're having that James is a punch to the stomach because he does not dance around anything, and he says some things in some really, really kinds of ways. And today is going to be one of those days. Take a look at what he says in what we call, well, first I want to talk about this idea. Diversity makes us different. Jesus makes us one. That's kind of, if you fall asleep the rest of the way, it'll be okay because you got this. Diversity makes us different. Reality is we are different. That's just how it is. We look different, we talk different, we grow up different, we see the world different. We're all different, and I think we just need to say that out loud. Diversity makes us different, but Jesus makes us one. And this is where we get to the church of all places, of all communities, should be the example here because we have Jesus. And Jesus did things different than anyone else ever. So it's his brother, James, who we've been looking at, that kind of says this. And for me, again, we always come back to this question, what would it take for your sibling to convince you that they were Lord? And at one point in what we're about to read, James refers to Jesus as his Lord. And then he gets into the thick of what we're talking about. This is what he says in what we call the second chapter. My dear brothers and sisters, how can you claim to have faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ if you favor some people over others? If you're like me, you lean in at this point and you go, did James just question my faith? Did James just tie my belief in Jesus to my behavior with other people? Did James just tie my Christianity to something like favoritism, prejudice, and racism? That's exactly what he just did. James says, listen, we've got to talk about your faith, because if it's in Jesus, then you don't show favoritism to anyone for any reason. Why? Because Jesus didn't show favoritism to anyone for any reason. And James uses these really broad terms that I find interesting because he could have gotten really pointed. But I think his goal is to make sure that we apply this in a lot of different arenas in our life. He says, listen, you can't favor some over others. We have these categories in our life, right? We just do. You maybe don't do it on purpose, but we naturally gravitate towards people that are just like us. And so the others are the people that aren't like us. We favor some, a select few that make us comfortable, that don't challenge us, that don't push us, that don't make us wonder if what we've always thought was right or wrong. We just like to be warm and safe and cozy. And James says if you start categorizing people like that and you choose the ones that you like best, you better take a hard look in the mirror, because that's not what Jesus ever said to do. Amen. And he uses this Greek phrase that I think is so interesting. Instead of favoring some, he talks about receiving people at face, or receiving the face. In our day and age, we would say we would judge a book by its cover. The idea here is that people in the group that James is addressing were looking at people based on their outside appearance and making judgments about them, deciding whether or not they belonged or didn't belong, deciding whether or not they were good to be around or if they could be ignored. And he says the problem with that is it keeps you shallow. Think about that. If you are only judging someone by their face, by their outward appearance, then you are about as shallow as they get. And I know that offends you, because it would bother me all day long if someone came to me and said, "You're shallow." There's something just revolting about that phrase to me. But the second we make a judgment about someone because of the color of their skin or the gender or whatever, we start doing the very opposite of who we're supposed to be. We receive them at face value, we keep our relationship on the surface, and we live a pretty shallow existence. And so what James does next is he gives, again, like a baseline example. One that we can be comfortable interacting with, because most of us read it and go, well, that's not me. I don't need to worry about that. And that's kind of what we do sometimes with these issues in our society. We go, that's not me, so I don't need to be concerned about it, right? I'm not prejudiced, so I don't need to worry about people that are. And so what he does is he goes, everybody can interact with this, because we're all tempted to behave in a certain way when a certain kind of person walks into the room. And this is the example he gives. He says, for example, suppose someone comes into your meeting dressed in fancy clothes and expensive jewelry, and another comes in who is poor and dressed in dirty clothes. If you give special attention and a good seat to the rich person, but you say to the poor one, "You can stand over there," or "You can sit on the floor," well, doesn't this discrimination show that your judgments are guided by evil desires? No, James. I'm not evil. I'm just human, right? Like, I'm evil? That's really strong. But that's what he gives as the genesis for discrimination. It's our motives. It's the motivations on the inside of us. That's the progression that he takes. It starts with evil motives, which turn into judgments, which turns into discrimination. The division that we create on the outside between different people in our life is a result of division on the inside. And James starts pointing to the problem is you are not changing the way you think. You have gotten to the place where you are comfortable with a series of check boxes. And if we do this, I can check that box off and say, I'm not guilty. But secretly, we still have thoughts that go through our heads. We hear an accent. We see some clothing. We see the color of skin. And without even realizing it, we've had a whole dialogue internally. And James says, that's something in here that you've got to deal with. Isn't it interesting that Paul said, if you want to be renewed, that's by the renewing of your mind. That's how you're transformed. It's changing the way you think about things, the very base, the initial reaction kind of stuff. And so don't settle for just doing some nice outward things that might get you a pat on the back. Rearrange how you view people how you think about people, and you see them the way that Jesus sees them. Because you know, Jesus died for them all. For God so loved the world that he came and gave his one and only Son. And then if you even go to the beginning of the whole thing, it says, and God made mankind in his image. Each of us has a little bit of God in us. So how dare we disrespect that piece of God? Don't worry, James isn't done, and it only gets more uncomfortable. Jump a couple sentences down, he says, yes, indeed, it's good when you obey the royal law as found in the scriptures, love your neighbor as yourself. James, that's the golden rule. I'm surprised Jesus didn't tell you that when you were growing up together. But the golden rule is you love your neighbor as yourself. James comes along and he says, no, it's the royal rule. And really smart people, way smarter than me, they get the title of scholar, have argued until they're blue in the face about why does he call it the royal rule? And they give three options, and at some point, when I'm like ready to run off into the hills and hide somewhere, I'd sit down all the scholars and say, you're arguing about something absolutely ridiculous, because it's all three of your three options at the same time. So yes, the royal law is meant to be a title of distinction. It's to set it apart and prioritize it as first. Royals number one, right? They get the most food, the best food every time. They get the best car, they get the best house. Royalty always gets first place. And so part of it is understand when Jesus said all of the law hangs on love God, love others, that's it. That's the top notch. That's what it means to follow Jesus. It's also just that, it's about affiliation. It's associated with Jesus. It's a royal law because it comes from the royal one. So don't miss it. If you want to follow Jesus, then you need to make sure that you obey this law where you love others as yourself.
Amen, brother.
And it's imitation, by the way. And if you need an example, we're not going to look at it this morning, but I'd encourage you to go into the Gospels and look at the moment where Jesus sits down with a Samaritan woman. She was the wrong race and the wrong gender, and Jesus spent a ton of time talking with her. So if that's who he was, and we're supposed to imitate him, then calling it the royal law is supposed to send off alarm bells in our head of, if anything, get this right. And sometimes I think Jesus is going to sit me down on the other side and he's going to go, bro, because Jesus would probably call me bro, right? And he'd say, like, I understand there were a lot of things that were kind of confusing, but this wasn't one of them. And I think he'll start hollering at me a little bit. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's not complicated. And I spelled it out clear for you. In fact, I said all of the Old Testament hangs on it. And you didn't get that? And I think he's going to sit the church down and he goes, you didn't get that? Like, of all the things, that's plain as day. Love your neighbor. No matter what they look like, no matter what they sound like, no matter what neighborhood they grew up in. You love them like yourself. Because if you don't, it's got a different title. If you favor some people over others, you are committing a sin. I'm going to read that again. If you favor some people over others, you are committing a sin. So let's make sure we are all on the same page. There's no more confusion from this day forward. Racism, sexism, and all of that is a sin. It's not touchy-feely. It's disobedience to who Jesus called us to be. And I know, like, sin feels icky and wrong, but it's like there's no arguing what James is saying here. Like, there's no way out of this. If we favor one group of people that are just like us over any other group, then we're sinful. He says you're guilty of breaking the law. You're guilty of breaking the royal law. The one thing that was clear. The one thing that was relatively simple. You broke it. So we come back to like what James asks at the very beginning. How can you have faith in Jesus and be okay with favoring a group of people over some other group? How can you condone or excuse or shove under the rug something like racism? How can you not fight for something that would stand against it? Because you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, I grew up going to church all of the time, and we always talked about the golden rule. And I always interpreted it like this, because I'm a people pleaser, and I like to get the pat on the back and somebody to look at me and go, "You're a good Christian." So I always interpret it as love your neighbor for yourself. Because if you love your neighbor and people see it, then they're going to tell you you're a good Christian. Well, that's just as shallow as judging someone by the exterior of their self, right? Like if I'm just doing it so I get an attaboy, it's like, God help me. I'm like self-deceived now. I mean, we go back to what we talked about last week. I'm only fooling myself. It doesn't say for yourself. And it doesn't say like yourself. It doesn't say love your neighbor like yourself, like the people that are like you. It says as yourself, as if they were you. So what would it look like in your neighborhood or in your office or in this church for no matter who you were interacting with, you treated them as if they were you, and you wrestled with, how would I want to be treated? What am I hoping they'll say? What am I hoping they won't say? What am I hoping they'll ask me? Because here's the danger, by the way. If you just look at someone as if they're you, then you're automatically going to assume you know everything about them, and you don't. So just ask more questions. Stop assuming so much. Because wouldn't that be what you wanted? Someone to, instead of assuming a bunch of things about you because of your clothes or your hairstyle or whatever, wouldn't you rather they just ask you questions and get clarity? I think that's the best approach. Love them as yourself. And this takes it beyond provision, because this is the other thing I used to do in Sunday school. Love your neighbor as yourself. I would never let myself go hungry, so feed the hungry. I would never let myself go naked, so clothe the people that can't clothe themselves. And it turned into like these little tasky kind of things that I could do. But I think it's deeper than that. If I'm going to love someone as myself, then I am going to advocate for them. Because I advocate for me with the stupidest of things. Like if they get my burrito wrong at Taco Bell, I go inside and I advocate for myself. I paid you $5 for this burrito. It's reasonable that I want it to be what I ordered. But we just put this in the realm of like, well, let's do some nice things here and there. No, it's advocacy and it's affection. If they're you, then you would never sit idly by and let people say something as ignorant as so often gets said. You wouldn't let something not get done when you knew it needed to get done. So here's the rubric I run it through. James says, whatever you say or whatever you do, remember that you will be judged by the law that sets you free. That's the royal law, by the way. There will be no mercy for those who have not shown mercy to others. But if you have been merciful, God will be merciful when he judges you. So here's Joshua's little tip for life, given what James just said. Be merciful. Like all the time, with everyone, every chance you get. You be scandalously merciful. You be ridiculously merciful. And here's why I suggest that you do that. Because I know me, and I'm a mess up and a screw up, and I'm going to get it wrong, and one day I'm going to sit before God, and do you know what I want him to be with me? merciful. Because I really don't believe Jesus is going to sit me down after he gets on me about screwing up the most simplest command. I don't think he's going to go, you know what, you were too merciful in your life. Like, he's just not going to say that. If there's one thing I can be sure of, it's that. So I'm going to be as merciful as possible so that when I'm sitting before God, he's that merciful with me. So you know what this means? All of this whole discussion, it rides on you. Not them. And I had to wrestle with this because it's easy for me. I'm married to someone who goes out and advocates and fights for these kinds of things and helps people understand how to connect in their workplace and do all those things. And I felt like, well, I get to put a badge right there. My wife, she's awesome at this. But it's me too. I don't get to say it's somebody else's job. I don't get to say it's someone else's responsibility. It's mine. And it is yours. It's ours. The church should be leading here, not letting somebody else take care of it. Why do we keep doing that? Why are we afraid? This is plain as day. We know we'd be doing the right thing. Because Jesus is the great equalizer. The cross leveled the playing field. And this is how I know, because Paul, who most people think is always at odds with James, they're never at odds. They really, I think, probably got along splendidly. They just point to some different ideas that kind of help us fully understand a central one. But this is what Paul says about the cross, the result of the gospel. Are you ready? Galatians, his letter to the Christians. He says, there's no longer Jew or Gentile, slave or free. There's no male or female. You are all one in Christ Jesus. One. No distinction. You know why we get uncomfortable with this? Because equality means there's no winner. And we love to win. It's like part of the American dream, right? 2-story house, white picket fence, dog named Fido, 2.5 kids, a nice car, and winning. But Jesus said, that's not what this is about. This is not about you winning. This is about you being like me. And I didn't draw any lines. I didn't make any distinctions. You see, the common denominator here, by the way, is not humanity, it's Jesus. That's why we should be the leaders here. Yes, we're all human, and I believe that we should respect that about each other and love each other because of that. But we should go a step further because Jesus is Jesus. And we say we follow him. We say we obey him. We say he's the leader of us. So if the followers aren't following the lead, what does it say about the leader to everybody else? Think about that. This should come so naturally to us. And I don't pretend like connecting a bunch of people that are different is easy. It's not. Apples and oranges and bananas and pears, they're all a little bit different, right? And it would feel a little overwhelming to try and make all those connections and make it feel like a single unit. But this isn't the place we operate from. You introduce Jesus to the center of this picture, it rearranges everything, and now all of a sudden we are united. Now all of a sudden we are one. Because we're connected to Jesus, and that makes us one. That's what Paul says. That's what James would argue. You may be saying this song. I'm going to get the words wrong, but I think it goes something like this. We used to sing this old hymn. When we all get to heaven, when we all see Jesus, what a day of rejoicing that will be. You remember that song? Google it if you don't know what I'm talking about. But we sing about this day of rejoicing when we're like literally in the presence of Jesus. You understand that you will be rejoicing with all sorts of people that do not look like you. You know that, right? Like, we're talking about the world being invited to that moment, which means odds are I'm going to be the minority there. Yeah, upper middle class, white, male, minority in the kingdom. Because Jesus didn't just come for me. So why would I ever act otherwise? Diversity makes us different. Jesus makes us one. So we better be leading. And here's how I think we start. We start with ourselves, right? Like, this is what we've talked about for the last couple weeks. We always have to come back to ourselves. Because Christianity is not about throwing gospel grenades at everybody else. It's about you let that thing sit in your lap and you wrestle with it first. And so here's 4 things that I've learned and that I'm trying to do that require honesty. And I'll tell you up front, they're uncomfortable. But it's the first few steps, think of them maybe as baby steps, toward us doing this better. Because I would love to see a day when our society comes to the church to figure out how we did racial reconciliation. Can you imagine that? What if they came to us? And all of the challenges with diversity that we face, what if they came to us? Step 1, look in the mirror. We already said that, but self-examination is so important, having an honest conversation with yourself about what prejudices you have, what racial tendencies you might have, and like, do not let yourself start looking to the side and going, well, at least I'm not them. Look at you. And part of that, for me, has been the second step, is to examine my narrative and just list out the pieces that might have been missing. Because what I've learned is your childhood kind of haunts you forever. Have you learned that? And part of my childhood that's missing is I grew up in kind of a bubble, and there were certain types of people that I was always around and others that I wasn't. And that has created some tendencies in me, maybe, or some beliefs or ways of looking at people that probably shouldn't have ever been there. And it wasn't because someone sat me down and said, this is how you do it. It's because no one ever sat me down and said, look broader. So what parts of your story are missing? Just name them. And then the third step is purposely make some connections with people different than you. Like I said, uncomfortable, but here's what I know. The second someone has a name, they're no longer just a number in a big bracket for you. The second someone has a name or is related to you or is your neighbor or is the desk over or is a kid in your classroom or whatever the case may be, the second they have a name, the discussion changes. Your operating system reboots. So build those connections and ask questions. You will be amazed at how big the world is. You will be amazed at how big God is. You'll be amazed at how particular your upbringing was. I had a whole discussion with a friend about washcloths not long ago. We grew up very differently. But washcloths, I had no idea what they were for. I don't know why they get set out. But he grew up, that was an integral part of every morning. It's amazing. And so, yes, that's a silly example. But again, you establish a baseline. Just imagine how crazy it'll be to learn some of the bigger things. Which is the fourth thing. Just crave truth. Crave truth over power, which is one of the motives that we kind of have seated in here. We want to be in the number one seat. Crave truth over preserving the way things have always been, right? Like that's kind of what we do too. Like, I've been comfortable. And so I just want to keep it comfortable. Crave truth over privilege. And I know it's easy to say, well, I don't have privilege. You do. You just need to crave truth more than that. And you'll find some of that in those relationships and in those discussions. And here's what I think we'll start to experience. We'll start to experience the kingdom now. Remember what Jesus said? Jesus came and he didn't say the kingdom's coming one day. He said the kingdom has come in me. I'm the great equalizer. So the better we get at this, the more we lead in this, the more we change the way we think, the more we get to experience that here and now instead of just waiting for one day it to all be better. Let's make it better. It'll be ultimately better one day, don't get me wrong. But let's make it better today. Let's make the kingdom reality in you, in me, in our hearts. Let's reject sin. Let's reject sin and never favor some over others. Will you pray with me? Jesus, I suppose a discussion like this lends itself to a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of assumptions. My hope, the one thing I'll ask you to do, God, is that you would just imprint in our hearts and brains the words of James, not the words of Josh. The words of James that I believe are ultimately your words. And as we head into our week ahead, back into our workplaces, back into our neighborhoods, back into our families, back into our community groups and our church here at large, Lord, will you give us real courage and a real heart for the things that are close to your heart? Help us not to miss the most clear instructions that you gave us. Maybe even help us to worry about those first, because they're the royal law. Lord, we want to make your heart and your kingdom known to the world. And we'll count on you to help us do just that. We love you.